The most dangerous thing a woman can do is decide a man past 60 has nothing left to protect. I let her decide that. My name is Walter Grady, and on a Tuesday morning in October, my son's wife looked at me across my own kitchen table and told me it was time I signed the house over, before things got complicated. I was 71 years old, drinking coffee out of a mug my late wife had bought at a county fair 30 years earlier, and I set that mug down very slowly, because I already knew this was the morning everything was going to change. Her name was Renata. She'd married my son Curtis 4 years back, and she had a way of talking to me like I was an appliance that still technically worked, but everyone was quietly waiting to replace. "It's not personal, Walter," she said, sliding a folder across the table, her nails clicking against the manila like she was counting seconds. "It's just smart planning. Curtis and I have talked about it. At your age, with the house this size, it makes sense for it to be in both our names. Protects everyone. Protects everyone." I looked at that folder the way you look at a dog that's been too quiet for too long. I wasn't shocked by the ask. People had been circling this house since the day I buried my wife in it, figuratively speaking. What surprised me was that Renata had finally worked up the nerve to put it in writing. "What exactly is this?" I said, though some old watchful part of me already knew. "A quitclaim deed," she said, the way you'd mentioned the mail had come. My attorney drew it up. Standard language. You'd retain what she called a life estate, meaning you can stay here as long as you're able to manage on your own. I looked at her, at the crisp blouse, at the phone she kept glancing at, even while delivering what she clearly considered good news. "I built this house with my hands, Renata. Every board of it. And that's exactly why we want to protect it," she said, and smiled, a smile that never once touched her eyes. "Take your time reading it. I'll leave it with you." She gathered her purse, kissed Curtis on the cheek on her way out. He'd been standing by the sink the whole time, saying nothing, the way he'd been saying nothing about a lot of things lately, and the door clicked shut behind her. I sat there a long while, picked up the folder, put it down, picked it up again. 14 pages, dense with clauses. A yellow sticky arrow pointing to the signature line like I might miss it otherwise. Somewhere around page 9, where it described my diminished capacity for independent asset management, something in my chest went very still. Not anger, clarity. Welcome back to the channel, and thank you for spending part of your day with an old man and his stories. If you're new here, grab your coffee, get comfortable, because this one's going to take some turns. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Hit that like button, and if you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means more than you'd think to a guy telling stories from his front porch. Now, this story doesn't start on that Tuesday in October. It starts 9 years earlier, on a Sunday afternoon in June, when Curtis brought a young woman named Renata Boyle up the porch steps of this house and told me she was going places, and he intended to be standing next to her when she got there. I remember thinking, at the time, that there are two kinds of ambition: the kind that pulls people up alongside you, and the kind that just uses you as a rung. I didn't know yet which kind I was looking at. Curtis had always been a good boy, soft-spoken, steady, a little too eager to please people who didn't deserve the effort. He worked in insurance underwriting, made a decent living, nothing flashy. Renata worked in commercial real estate, and from the very first dinner, she made sure everyone at the table knew it. Talked about closings the way some men talk about ball scores. I sat at the head of that table, my late wife Dottie's chair empty beside me, 4 years empty by then, and I watched Renata clock every detail of the house. The land, the barn out back I'd converted into a workshop, the acreage that backed up to the river. She asked, very casually, over pie, whether the property had ever been appraised. I told her I didn't see the need. A house isn't worth anything until you're planning to lose it. Here's what Renata thought she knew about me in those early years. Widowed contractor, retired, modest pension, a house that was worth something on paper but was mostly just old and full of memory. A man who fixed his own gutters and drove a truck with 210,000 miles on it and clipped coupons out of the Sunday paper out of pure old habit. Here's what was actually true and what Renata never once thought to ask. 41 years, I ran a small commercial construction company out of a two-bay garage that grew, slowly, stubbornly, into something that built half the strip malls and warehouses in 3 counties. I sold that company 11 years before Renata ever set foot on my porch. Sold it to a regional builder out of Charlotte for a number that made my accountant, a careful man named Herb Callahan, actually stand up out of his chair. I didn't throw a party. I didn't buy a boat. I paid off Curtis's student loans without telling him where the money came from. Set up a modest trust for my granddaughter's college that nobody in the family knew existed, and put the rest into land, into a handful of small manufacturing businesses I quietly held pieces of, and into an account Dottie and I used to joke was for emergencies, though we both knew it was really for peace of mind. I drove the old truck because I liked the old truck. Money that announces itself invites people who want a piece of it. I'd watched two of my own business partners over the years get eaten alive by relatives who smelled money the second it stopped being modest. I decided a long time ago that the quietest man in the room lives the longest life. Renata thought she was marrying into a paid-off house and a pension. She was marrying into a man who owned 3 commercial properties under a holding company she'd never heard of, held a silent stake in a regional trucking outfit, and hadn't told a living soul his actual net worth in over a decade. But I'm getting ahead of myself. They got married on a Saturday in September, a small ceremony at a vineyard 40 minutes outside town. Renata's choice, intimate, she called it. Efficient, I thought, but kept that to myself. 60 guests. Renata's business partners sent an arrangement of white orchids that must have cost more than my first truck. I remember thinking, at the time, why would business partners send wedding flowers that expensive for a junior associate marrying an insurance man's son? I filed that thought away the way I file everything. The first 2 years were fine. I want to say that honestly, because this isn't a story about a woman who was cruel from day one. Renata could be genuinely warm when she wanted something and genuinely useful when it served her, and for a while those two things overlapped enough that it looked, from the outside, like a decent marriage. Then came year 3. A Thursday evening in April, and Curtis had taken my grandson to a school function. And I was over at their place. I still had a key, still did small repairs around their house out of habit, a leaking faucet, a sticking door, and I was looking for the shut-off valve in what they used as a home office. And there, on the desk, sitting open on Renata's laptop, because she'd stepped out to take a call, was a document titled E-State Long View. My first thought was that it was a strange thing to leave open on a screen. My second thought, once I'd read the first paragraph, was that my Thursday evening had just ended. I read it twice, standing there, faucet forgotten. Then I sat down in Renata's desk chair, which if you knew me, you'd understand was 4 minutes longer than I sit still for anything. 19 pages. Thorough. Cold. My own life laid out like a construction timeline. Phase 1. Encourage voluntary transfer of primary residence. Phase 2. Formalize Curtis as sole trustee of any remaining assets. Phase 3. Manage the transition into assisted living in a manner that preserves family goodwill. And, on page 11, a name I recognized. Denny Faulkner, a commercial appraiser who'd shaken my hand at 2 Thanksgivings and always called me Chief, Chief. I closed the laptop, fixed the faucet, drove home, and made myself a proper dinner. Because some situations require the kind of focus that only comes from doing something with your hands. And sitting there at my own table that night, alone, I understood something almost worse than the plan itself. She hadn't married into this family, in spite of my quiet, modest life. She'd married into it because of it. Think about it. No public profile. No lawyer of my own she'd ever met. No visible assets beyond a paid-off truck and a house that, on paper, looked exactly as tired as it was old. A widower who fixed his own gutters and clipped coupons was, in her careful estimation, a manageable variable, not an obstacle, a line item. I want to be honest about something, because this story isn't only about strategy, and I won't pretend it is. There were nights that spring where I sat on that porch, after everyone had gone home, looking out at the dark line where the yard meets the tree line, and felt something that didn't have a clean name. Not rage exactly, something closer to grief. I had genuinely loved having this young woman in the family. I'd walked her down a metaphorical aisle in my own mind 100 times, told myself Curtis had found someone sharp enough to keep up with him. I had wanted it to be real. Even after I read that document, some stubborn, foolish part of me wanted it to be real. I sat with that a good long while, one night in particular, a cold one in late April, coyotes going somewhere off in the dark. And then I went inside, locked up, and the next morning I drove into town and started making calls. Because wanting something to be different and letting it cost you everything are two very different choices, and I had built too much in this life to make the second one now. If you've been with me a while, do me one favor, hit subscribe. A lot of folks listen without ever doing it, and I understand, but it truly does help more than you'd guess. Drop a like. Tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. Now, let me tell you something about patience, because I've had 71 years to think about it, and most people get it backwards. They think patience is passive, soft, the thing you do when you've run out of other options. They're wrong. Patience is the most aggressive thing a man can practice. It's waking up every single morning knowing exactly what's coming for you and choosing to fix the faucet anyway, choosing to show up to Sunday dinner, choosing to sit across the table from the woman who has your entire dismantling mapped out in a document called Estate Longview and not letting your face know a single thing about it. That's not weakness. That's war fought at a volume nobody else can hear. The first call I made was to a man named Otis Bear, an estate attorney I'd used exactly once before, 17 years back, to help me set up the original trust for my granddaughter, the one nobody in the family knew existed. Otis had retired from litigation and mostly did quiet, careful work now, the kind that doesn't show up in courthouse records unless someone forces it to. He drove out to the house that Saturday, sat at my kitchen table with black coffee he didn't touch, and listened while I told him everything. The vineyard wedding, the white orchids from business partners, the document open on the laptop, Denny Faulkner's name on page 11. Otis didn't interrupt once, which for a lawyer is rarer than you'd think. When I finished, he sat back, looked at the ceiling fan turning slow over the table, and said, "She wrote it down." 19 pages, I said. He looked at me directly. "That's either remarkably confident or remarkably careless." "Both," I said, "and we're going to use both." He pulled a legal pad toward him. "What do you want to do?" I slid a single sheet of notebook paper across the table, my own handwriting on it, 3 lines I'd worked out over that long April night. He read it. His eyebrows went up slowly, the particular way they do when a man who has genuinely seen everything sees something new. "You've been sitting on this since April," he said. "I've had time to think, Otis. This is going to take real time to build properly." She gave me the timeline herself, I said. "Phase 3 doesn't kick in for years yet. We've got runway." He looked at that sheet of paper one more time and did something I hadn't seen Otis Bear do in 17 years of knowing him. He smiled. "All right, Walter," he said. "Let's build something quiet." We started that Monday. First thing, a small holding entity, registered clean, boring on purpose. We called it Fenwick Creek Holdings, a name dull enough to make a bank teller's eyes glaze over, and boring names, I've found, hide interesting things better than clever ones ever do. The first move through Fenwick Creek was the one that mattered most. Renata worked for a mid-sized commercial firm called Boyle Ashcroft, her father's name still on the door even though he'd stepped back from day-to-day operations years earlier, and the firm was, at that exact moment, quietly raising a small round of outside capital to fund an expansion into 2 new markets. It was the thing Renata talked about at every family dinner, the expansion, the projections, the ambition of it, the centerpiece of everything she was building her own name around inside that company. I bought in, silently, through Fenwick Creek, through a secondary entity that connected back to it the way a shadow connects to the man casting it, only visible if you already know exactly where the light's coming from. She never once looked for the light. Otis spread the investment across 3 separate closings so no single transaction would trip a disclosure that might catch a curious eye. Clean, invisible, utterly boring on paper. About 10 weeks after I found that document open on her laptop, I owned a quiet piece of the very firm she was building her whole identity around. She made me a birthday dinner that spring and called me, in front of the whole family, the most solid man I know. I told her I still had a few surprises left in me. She had absolutely no idea how right I was. Here's the part people never quite believe when I tell it. They expect me to say, I went cold, checked out, started avoiding the family. I didn't. I fixed the faucet whenever it stuck again. I showed up to every school function for my grandson. I asked Renata real questions about the expansion over dinner, and I meant them, because the moment she sensed even a flicker of a shift in me, the whole thing would have unraveled. And Renata could read a room the way some people read weather instinctively, before anyone else even felt the pressure drop. So I gave her nothing to read. I smiled. I showed up. I fixed what needed fixing. And every other Saturday morning, I drove 45 minutes to a small office park where Otis kept a suite, and quietly dismantled the entire foundation she thought she'd built her future on top of. Revenge, I've come to learn, doesn't have to look like revenge at all. Sometimes it looks exactly like a devoted father-in-law. By that fall, I'd moved into the second piece of it. Boyle Ashcroft's expansion depended heavily on securing 2 anchor tenants for a new development outside Greensboro, and one of the 2 prospective tenants, a regional logistics company, was quietly looking for a capital partner of its own to fund the build-out. I bought in there too. Not a controlling stake, nothing loud, just enough presence at the table that when Renata's team sat down to negotiate lease terms, the people across from them answered, several invisible layers removed. To me, she was negotiating against people who worked for her father-in-law and didn't know it. I won't pretend that didn't sit well with me. I'm only human, same as anyone. That October, Otis called on a Thursday morning, no greeting, straight to it, the way he always did when it mattered. "Denny Faulkner," he said. I set my coffee down. "Talk to me. Runs a small side appraisal and advisory shop. 6 clients, all quiet money. He's been shopping for someone to help him formalize it into a real fund. Quiet money," I said. My favorite 2 words in the English language. He'd take a modest anchor investment from the right partner. "Become the right partner," I said. "Arm's length, Otis. 3 layers, minimum. He calls you chief, Walter. I want 4 layers," I said. Otis actually laughed, the first time I'd heard him laugh in months. 4 layers. Understood. By early winter, I was a silent partner in Denny Faulkner's little advisory fund. The same man who'd shaken my hand at 2 Thanksgivings, who'd once appraised this very house at a figure I suspected was deliberately low, was now, entirely without knowing it, in business with the chief himself. By January, here's what the whole quiet structure looked like. Fenwick Creek holding a real stake in Boyle Ashcroft's expansion. The logistics tenant, carrying my capital, anchoring the very development Renata's career was riding on. Denny Faulkner's fund, backed 4 layers deep by me. And Renata? Renata was having the best year of her career. The expansion was moving. Her father was talking about her taking a formal partnership title. She had no idea the ground underneath all of it belonged, quietly, to the man she'd once described in a 19-page document as a manageable line item. She was standing on my floors and calling the house hers. The Tuesday in October when she slid that quitclaim deed across my kitchen table was exactly 18 months to the week after I'd found her document open on that laptop. Otis called that same afternoon. "Everything's in position," he said. "You want me to draft a response to the deed?" "Not a response," I said. "A revelation." "How thorough do you want it?" "I want her attorney to stand up and shut his office door when he opens it." "Give me 3 weeks. You've got 2. 2 weeks later, Otis walked into my kitchen carrying a folder considerably thicker than 14 pages, set it down like it might go off. I read through it slow, careful, the way you read something you've been waiting a long time to hold. Fenwick Creek's full holdings. The Boyle Ashcroft stake, fully documented. The logistics tenant. The Faulkner fund. All 4 layers traced cleanly back to me. 52 pages in total. Her deed had been 14. She'd brought a folder. I came back with the whole filing cabinet. "Send it to her attorney," I said. The response came 4 days later. Not from Renata, but from her own family's longtime attorney, a careful man named Preston Whitlock, who'd handled Boyle Ashcroft's legal work for over 20 years and, by reputation, had genuinely seen everything a family firm could produce. Otis said the call lasted 11 minutes, and that Whitlock spoke the entire time like a man crossing a frozen lake he wasn't sure would hold him. "Mr. Bear," he said carefully, "your client's holdings are considerably more extensive than the family had understood." "Yes," Otis said. They are. Mr. Grady's daughter-in-law would like to revisit the framing of the property discussion. Otis looked across the table at me. I shook my head once. The deed she drafted stands exactly as written, Otis said. Mr. Grady has no interest in signing it, and no interest in revisiting anything. A long silence on the line. I see, Whitlock said finally. I'll be in touch. Otis hung up, looked at me. How do you feel? I thought about that April night, coyotes somewhere out past the tree line, a document called Estate Longview glowing on a laptop screen that was never meant for my eyes. I stood up, reached for my jacket off the hook by the door. Hungry? I said. Let's get pie. There's a particular moment in a long, quiet campaign like this one, where the whole board shifts, and it never happens with an explosion. No raised voices, no table getting flipped. Just a quiet, irreversible tilt, like a barn roof that's already decided to come down and just hasn't told you the exact day yet. That moment came a few days after Whitlock's call. I wasn't there when he sat Renata down, but Otis had a friend at that firm, and the friend said Whitlock closed his office door and didn't come out for the better part of an hour. An hour, in that kind of meeting, means the math isn't adding up the way somebody thought it would. It means somebody made an expensive miscalculation, and it means the game, functionally, is already over. Renata came out to the house on a Wednesday afternoon, which was itself the first sign, because Renata never came out midweek. The woman treated her office like her real address and this family like an appointment she occasionally kept. But there she was, sitting on my porch steps when I pulled the truck in, no blazer, no phone in her hand, just sitting, looking out at the yard like she'd never actually seen it before. I knew immediately what this was. I didn't let my face know it. Hey now, I said, climbing out of the truck. Didn't expect you out here today. She looked up at me for a long moment, really looked, the way she had that very first Sunday afternoon on this same porch 9 years back, like I was a puzzle she hadn't quite solved yet. Preston called me, she said. My attorney did that, yes. I sat down on the top step, not too close, took my time about it. Everything all right? I said. Walter. Renata. She exhaled slow, the particular way people do when they've been carrying something heavy for hours, and the body just finally sets it down whether you're ready or not. Fenwick Creek, she said. I turned to look at her properly. What about it? You know what about it? Quiet settled over that porch. Out past the yard, a dog barked somewhere down the road, and the light was doing that low gold thing it does in October, indifferent to whatever was happening on my porch steps. How long? She asked, her voice held steady. I'll give her that. Even at the very end, Renata didn't crack easy. How long what? I said. Since when did you know? I crossed my arms, looked at the young woman who'd sat at my table for 9 Thanksgivings, who'd once drafted my entire remaining life into a document and filed it under a folder labeled, with what I now understood was total sincerity, Longview. Since that April, in your office, I said. The laptop. She closed her eyes for just a second, long enough that I could see the calculation running behind them. You saw it, she said quietly. I saw it. Silence again, longer this time. You never said one word, she said. Neither did you. She stood up slow, walked a few steps out into the yard, stood there with her back to me looking toward the tree line. I let her stand there. I hadn't been in a hurry for 18 months. I wasn't about to start now. How much? She said finally, not turning around. How much what? How much do you actually have, Walter? It wasn't really a question. It was the sound of a woman doing arithmetic she already knew she wasn't going to like. More than Denny Faulkner ever appraised, I said. She turned around then, and I saw something I hadn't expected from her, not in 9 years. Not calculation, not fury. Something stripped down and plain. For just one moment she looked like a person instead of a long view. What do you want, Walter? She said, quieter now. What do you actually want out of this? I looked at her a long moment. I thought about the honest answer, not the strategic one. What did I want? I had wanted a real daughter, in the way a man wants that when his own daughter died young and left a hole nothing quite fills. I had wanted the young woman who sat on this porch 9 years ago and asked me real questions about the barn, about the land, about Dottie. But that girl had been understood now. mostly a performance aimed at an appraisal she was still running. And you cannot want back something that was never entirely real to begin with. Nothing you haven't already offered me, I said. The deed stands exactly as you wrote it. I'm not signing it. I never intended to. She stared at me, waiting for whatever trick came next. You have a piece of my father's firm, she said. I do. And the Greensboro tenant. Also me. 4 layers deep, if you're curious. She shook her head slowly, not in anger exactly, in something closer to disbelief. You built all of that, she said, while I was sitting at this table every Sunday, while you fixed our faucet. You were building phase 3, I said. I was building the rest of the board. She went quiet a long while, long enough that the light shifted again, the way October light does, sliding gold into gray. When she finally spoke, her voice had gone composed again, back to the Renata everyone at Boyle Ashcroft knew, controlled, professional. But her eyes stayed different. I underestimated you, she said. I held her gaze. Yes, I said. You did. She nodded once, walked back up the steps past me without another word, got in her car, and drove off down the gravel road. I sat on that porch a good while after, watching the dust settle behind her taillights. It didn't feel like winning, not exactly. It felt like something ending that should have ended kinder, from the very start. I went inside, poured a glass of water, drank it standing at the sink, then called Otis. She knows, I said. How'd she take it? I thought about that a second. Like herself, I said, right up until she didn't. The formal conversations that followed happened mostly through the attorneys. Over the following month, 3 of them in a conference room downtown, 4 blocks from Otis's quiet little office suite, which I found I quietly enjoyed. The deed Renata had drafted protected exactly what she'd listed on it. The house, framed as a joint asset, nothing more, nothing less. It said not one word about Fennec Creek, not one word about the Greensboro tenant or the Faulkner Fund. Because she'd drafted that deed in a world where Walter Grady was a retired contractor with a paid-off house and a pension and nothing else worth mapping out. She'd protected herself, and by extension, Curtis, against the man she believed she'd married into. She had no protection at all against the man she'd actually married into. Preston Whitlock, Otis told me later, sat across that table, looking like a man solving a puzzle where somebody had quietly swapped out half the pieces overnight. The deed's straightforward, Otis told him, pleasant as ever. Mr. Grady's house remains his, entirely, exactly as he built it. And his other holdings? Whitlock asked. Not part of any family discussion, Otis said. Never were. She'll want to revisit the family estate conversation broadly. On what grounds? Otis said. She's the one who wrote the framework. Whitlock had no real answer for that. Neither, in the end, did Renata. I never did sign that deed. It sat in a drawer in my kitchen for a while, and then one evening I burned it in the fire pit out back, mostly for the small, quiet satisfaction of watching 14 pages of somebody's long view curl up into nothing in about 90 seconds. Curtis and I had a long, hard conversation that winter, longer than any conversation we'd had in years, and to his credit, my son sat on that porch and cried, actual tears, and said he'd known something was wrong for a long time, and hadn't let himself look at it directly. I told him I understood that better than he knew. We're still working through it, he and I, slowly, the way you rebuild anything worth keeping. Renata and Curtis separated that spring. I didn't push for it, and I didn't mourn it either. Boyle Ashcroft's board, once the Greensboro tenant situation became fully visible during the separation proceedings, asked some very pointed questions about who actually held influence over the firm's newest development, and Renata's path to partnership quietly stalled out somewhere in that conversation. Denny Faulkner stopped calling me chief around then too, mostly because he finally understood, 4 layers down, exactly whose money had been anchoring his little fund the whole time. I never made a single call to make any of that happen. I never had to. Momentum, once it's set loose, does its own work. That spring, the regional trucking outfit I'd held a silent stake in for years reached out, through Otis, about expanding my role a seat on their board, formal this time, not silent. I sat with that letter a long while on the porch, thought about a Sunday afternoon 9 years back, A young woman climbing these same steps asking casual questions about acreage and river frontage over a slice of pie. I called Otis back. Tell them I'll take the seat, I said. Not as an advisor, on the board. Someone who actually built something ought to have a say in what gets built next. You know she'll hear about the announcement eventually. Otis said, I imagine she will. I looked out past the yard toward the tree line, the light doing its slow gold thing again, indifferent as ever to anything happening on this particular porch. And that's fine, I said. It's just business now. On a Saturday morning that June, I read about the board appointment in the local business section over coffee at the little diner in town where nobody makes a fuss over an old man in a ball cap. Good coffee. Nobody there knows a thing about Fenwick Creek, and that's still my favorite part of any of it. My old friend Sal called around 10 that morning. Saw the write-up, he said. Morning, Sal. Walter. A pause. I told you 9 years ago that girl had an agenda. Told you at Curtis's engagement dinner, if you'll recall. You did, I said. You were right, same as always. So what now? Now, I said. Now I finish my coffee. That's really it. That's really it, Sal. I set the cup down, looked out the diner window at the town square. Same as it's looked my whole life. I built what I built. I protected what needed protecting. She made her choices, same as anybody does. And I made mine. And you're all right with all of it? He asked. I thought about that honestly. Thought about that cold night in April, coyotes calling somewhere past the tree line. Thought about the faucet I kept fixing long after I knew better. Thought about what I'd wanted out of that porch 9 years ago and what I'd actually ended up with instead, and how sometimes those two things, even when they turn out to be nothing alike, still manage to add up to a life a man can live inside comfortably. Yeah, I said, I'm all right. And the thing is, sitting there in that diner, with the whole town moving past the window, same as it always has, I meant every word of it. If this one landed with you, I'd be grateful if you'd hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like it, real ones, family ones, the kind that take their time getting where they're going. I'll see you on the porch next time.